It's supposedly one of the top 50 movies ever made. And in terms of influence, it may well be The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly by Sergio Leone, spaghetti western from 1966. Let me tell you what I think is great and what is not so great about this movie coming up next. As everybody knows, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is culturally iconic, primarily for the score by Ennio Morricone. Alright, I can't play much of that because I'll get demonetized. As well as the look, just the look of Clint Eastwood, his character, the man with no name, also nicknamed Blondie in this movie. No one can deny the power and influence of this artist after this movie. From 1966 onward, it changed the Western and influenced, obviously, Sam Peckinpah and his reworking of the Western and The Wild Bunch, and later, Quentin Tarantino. Pretty much every movie that has gunplay, some snark in it, some clever, hip-looking characters. This movie is very playful as well. It is very impactful on movies from 1966 to the present day. Let's start with what I think is great about this movie. First, the opening credits sequence. This moment in the early 60s, beginning, I think, in the late 50s, early 60s, where the opening credits sequence becomes a thing, a spectacle in and of itself. And here, this movie shows you a lot of stills and clips from the entire movie, something they still do in action movies today, such as Mission Impossible. It's a very exciting and artful opening credits sequence. Obviously, it has the famous score playing over it. And really the excitement from this opening credit sequence just propels us into the movie. To me, it's, the first 30 minutes are really outstanding here. By this point, Leone had made many spaghetti westerns. Obviously, this is the third in the Man with No Name trilogy. And so he really knows what he's doing. All of the shot making, each of the shots is amazing. They're all paintings. They're all well constructed. And then the editing of this movie, shots to shots to shots, usually close shots or extreme close shots of faces cutting straight into long shots of the same characters. The use of depth in this movie, the use of framing in the cinematography is absolutely wonderful, and you can see why filmmakers who are technically interested in how this movie was made could be inspired by it. As well, the faces in this movie are really amazing. Leone picked pretty much all the actors, including the bit parts, really interesting faces to look at. And that's one of the keys in movies, is for movie makers to pick interesting looking people. Not just beautiful people. Yes, beautiful people work really well, but odd looking people, unusual looking people. And it's not just Clint Eastwood's face, which obviously is one of the greatest faces in movie history. Lee Van Cleef, the bad character here, has a really devilish looking, a wonderful, amazing looking face. One of the more horrific looking, scarier looking faces in cinema history. And then another thing to remember is that the real star of this movie is Eli Wallach's character of Tuco. He's probably in it for 60 to 70% of the movie. He has the most lines. He's interacting with the Blondie character, the man with no name, and there's more Tuco in this movie, as I'm trying to say, than anybody else. And I think the reason this movie is great, or in the top 50, it's not just Clint Eastwood or Lee Van Cleef, it's Eli Wallach's performance as Tuco, which is really fun. He's a plucky character. He's always getting into trouble, getting himself out of trouble. He's really funny sometimes. And this Eli Wallach performance stands out among pretty much any Western movie ever made. One more thing that's great about this movie is the ending, which is bloated. It has a lot of extra shots. I mean, the showdown is over the top. It's not just two people showing down, as is typical in Western movies. It's, spoiler alert, three people in the showdown, and it's a 5-minute sequence at a wonderful location. I mean, this circular, humongous circular graveyard where the buried treasure is supposed to be is amazing as a location, as a place for the final showdown. And I would recommend studying this final showdown sequence in order to understand sort of how to put together a scene with a lot of tempo in it. And by tempo, I mean something slow, something fast, something moves from slow to fast or fast to slow in terms of the editing and the cuts and in terms of the distance between the camera and the people in the frame. Now, there are a lot of great things about this movie, no doubt. I'm going to give you my judgment, and you're going to dislike this, some of you, is that I don't think this is one of the top 50 movies ever made, not even perhaps in the top 500, and here's why. One is the basic plot. There's a lot of deus ex machina in this plot. That is, just things happen to get the characters out of situations or into situations. A lot of serendipity or a lot of terrible luck. The plot is pretty basic. It could be done in 45 minutes to an hour, and you really have a short film here in terms of the overall plot. These three characters are just going to go find buried treasure. They're going to help each other, or they're going to, get it for themselves. That's the main tension in the movie. The purpose of the movie, the main plot goal, doesn't actually show up until an hour into the movie. This is a 3-hour movie. It would never get made today, circa 2021, because you'd have to have the main plot announced within probably 5 minutes or 10 minutes into the movie. In fact, you don't even know that all three characters know one another until about an hour and 20 minutes into the movie when they all get together. Finally, it takes almost half the movie for that to happen. I'm not saying that's bad or good. I'm just observing that fact and noting you couldn't do that today. In fact, you probably couldn't do it after, say, 1980 or so, when the blockbusters hit, which are much quicker and much, audience friendly than this movie. But back to the serendipity, the characters get into and out of situations just by luck, just by chance, and it's if the script writers are just making things happen. Now, again, this is a playful movie, verging on postmodernist, to show us that this movie is artfully constructed, and it wants to wink at us a lot of times, showing that it knows itself is a made, creation. It knows that it's a movie. And that may be okay if it's... And that may justify the deus ex machina, but okay, it may be lazy script writing for some of you who know how to write and know how these kinds of things need to be tightfully and artfully constructed. One of my big problems with this movie is the tonal dissonance here. Now, on the one hand, you've got a lot of gunplay that is celebrated, and it's fun, supposedly, within the movie world, and I think we viewers are supposed to appreciate the funniness and the gunplay, the humor of the gunplay here. But along with that, there are long stretches in this movie that sort of lament war and big wars. Here in the movie, it's the American Civil War, as this movie takes place during, I think, 1863, 1864, in the Civil War. There's a big battle in New Mexico where this movie is supposedly set. Now, as a Lee Van Cleef character cackles, beating up a woman, which is very brutal and hard to watch nowadays, and then he has fun shooting a man who employed him, then you get a scene where he goes through a war zone and is shaking his head and laments the follies of war. It's very weird to see a character who probably shouldn't care less about wars. After all, he himself is a murderer, and yet he's the one who's giving us all this emotional resonance, and the viewers are supposed to lament the effects of war while, I think, celebrating all the gunplay in this movie. Do you see the disconnect there in the messaging? Now, I know that World War II had just happened 20 years before this, affecting Italy, for example, and Leone's homeland, as well. The Vietnam War is getting going at this time, and a number of other wars around planet Earth, and the threat of war, the Cold War, for example. So there's no doubt why this American Civil War is in the movie for viewers at the time. Nevertheless, these war scenes seem, I think, to us today out of place, probably primarily because this movie, the bits of it that are humorous, fun, the gunplay, etc., have been copied and imitated all over the place for the last 50 to 60 years. And meanwhile, the sort of maudlin laments that we feel have been left behind. You don't get a lot of that, and you certainly don't get the mix of the two very often in movies. Now, at 3 hours long, this movie is, I think, very long. It turns my brain to mush because there's not a lot of thinking going on, besides admiring the technical expertise of the actors and cinematographers and directors and the composer here. But what is this movie really about? Well, It's not about actually that much in my particular view. It's about fun at the movies and all the way the movies signal to us how awesome they are. And that's how this movie has been used in a lot of marketing ever since it was made. But because of the Deus Ex Machina and the sort of the weird shifts in tone in this movie, and then the celebration of all of the gunplay, which may end up being disturbing for a number of viewers, I'm not sure that we can call this movie all that great artistically or complexly. Depends on what you mean by great, obviously. And if by great you mean culturally iconic, yeah, this movie is certainly a top 50 movie for sure. If by great, and this is what I usually mean by great, you mean philosophically complex, aesthetically interesting, and tied into the philosophy and the theology, if it has any, or the religious aspects, the social, the cultural, the psychological aspects of this aren't as interesting or complex as a number of other westerns, which I've covered some of them on this channel. Now, if you love this movie, great. I'm sure some of you have been heavily influenced by it. So for all those reasons, it's partly great and it's partly not so great to me. What do you think about this movie and about this video? Be kind. Please subscribe to this channel for more great content. Thank you. Have a great day.